My name is Alexandra. I grew up in a small village on the edge of the dense, ancient forests of Eastern Europe. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the dark woods, warning his children to never stray too far. They told tales of Baba Yaga, the fearsome witch who lived in a hut on chicken legs, who kidnapped children and held them in her enchanted home. As a child, I thought these were just stories meant to scare us, but I was wrong. It was a cold autumn evening when I first encountered the legend. I was 14, old enough to know better than to wander into the forest alone, but my younger brother Mikhail had gone missing. He was only 8, and as soon as I realized he wasn't in the house, a chill of dread settled in my chest. The forest had an eerie silence that night, a silence that seemed to echo the name Baba Yaga. I grabbed a lantern and ventured into the woods. The path quickly disappeared beneath a thick canopy of twisted trees, and the air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was breathing against me. "Mikhail," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. As I delved deeper, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to snatch me away. I nearly turned back, but then I heard a faint cry for help, unmistakably Mikhail's voice. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, weaving through the underbrush until I stumbled upon a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood the legendary hut. It looked exactly as the stories described, a rickety old house perched atop giant chicken legs, swaying slightly as if it was alive. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't turn back now. Mikhail was inside, I could feel it. Summoning all my courage, I approached the hut. As I neared, the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and something else, something metallic blood. I suppressed a gag and moved further in, calling softly, "Mikhail, are you here?" Alexandra, his voice was weak, but it was him. I followed the sound to a small room at the back of the hut. There he was, tied to a chair, his face pale and tear-streaked. I rushed to him, fumbling with the knots. "Don't worry, I'm here." "I'll get you out," I whispered, my fingers working frantically. "You shouldn't have come," a voice croaked behind me. I spun around to see her Baba Yaga. She was tall and gaunt, her skin a sickly gray, eyes like black pits. She wore a tattered shawl, and her bony fingers clutched a gnarled staff. "Now you'll never leave." Fear gripped me, but I couldn't show it. "Let us go," I demanded, though my voice wavered. "We mean you no harm." Baba Yaga cackled, a sound that made my blood run cold. "Harm? Child, you've entered my domain. Now you belong to me." She waved her staff, and the room seemed to spin around us. I clung to Mikhail, shielding him with my body. "Please," I begged. "We'll do anything. Just let us go." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Anything, you say?" A sinister smile crept across her face. "Very well. I will let you go, but you must perform a task for me first. Fail, and you will remain here forever." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want us to do?" Baba Yaga leaned in close, her breath rancid. "There is a dark power growing in these woods, a power even I cannot control. It is bound to a cursed object, a locket, lost many years ago. You must find it and bring it to me. Only then will I release you and your brother." I had no choice but to agree. With a wave of her staff, she untied Mikhail and pushed us out of the hut. "Remember," she hissed, "fail and you are mine forever." The forest seemed even darker as we set out on our quest. Mikhail clung to my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly. "Alexandra, what if we can't find it?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to," I said, trying to sound confident. "We just have to." We searched for what felt like hours, the forest growing more menacing with each passing moment. The trees seemed to whisper and moan, their branches clawing at us as we moved through the underbrush. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking terror. Finally, as dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the trees, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown graveyard. It was a place I had never seen before, hidden deep within the forest. The graves were ancient, the headstones cracked and covered in moss. And there, among the graves, lay the locket. It was a delicate silver thing, its surface tarnished with age. As soon as I picked it up, a chill ran through me, and I felt a dark presence surround us. "We need to get back," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We raced back to Baba Yaga's hut, the forest seeming to close in around us, as if it wanted to keep us from leaving. When we finally burst into the clearing, Baba Yaga was waiting. Her eyes gleamed as she saw the locket in my hand. "You have done well," she said, her voice filled with a dark satisfaction. "Give it to me." I hesitated, but what choice did I have? I handed her the locket, and she smiled a wicked, toothless grin. "You have fulfilled your task. You are free to go." Mikhail and I didn't wait to be told twice. We fled the hut, running until we were back in the safety of our village. It wasn't until we were home that we finally felt safe. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that Baba Yaga's eyes are still on me, watching from the shadows. The villagers still tell the stories, and now I know the truth. Baba Yaga is real, and she is always watching, waiting for her next victim. And sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear her cackle echoing through the trees, reminding me that we are never truly free from her grasp. My name is Elijah Thompson, and I have lived my entire life in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of northern Canada. The land here is both beautiful and brutal, a place where survival often comes at a steep price. It was during one particularly harsh winter that I encountered the horror that would change my life forever: the Wendigo. The winter of 1898 was the coldest anyone could remember. The snow piled up in drifts higher than a man's head, and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful ghost. My small cabin, nestled deep in the woods, felt more like a prison than a refuge. The isolation was oppressive, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gnawed at my sanity. I had been living alone since my wife, Mary, passed away 3 years earlier. Her death had left a void in my heart that I filled with long hunting trips and hard labor. That winter, the game was scarce, and I had to venture farther from home to find any meat to sustain myself. The hunger was constant, a gnawing pain that grew more intense with each passing day. It was on one of these hunting trips that I first heard the tales of the Wendigo. I had traveled to a nearby trading post to barter for supplies when I overheard some trappers speaking in hushed tones. They spoke of a creature, a malevolent spirit that possessed men, turning them into ravenous monsters who craved human flesh. They said the Wendigo was most active during the harshest winters when food was scarce and desperation drove men to madness. I dismissed their stories as mere superstition, the ramblings of men who had spent too much time in the wilderness. But as the days grew colder and the nights darker, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. The forest, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. One evening, as I was chopping wood, I heard a distant scream. It was a sound that sent chills down my spine, a cry of pure terror that echoed through the trees. I dropped my axe and listened, but the forest had fallen silent again. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in my bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin as the wind battered its walls. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. As the hours dragged on, my mind began to play tricks on me. I imagined the Wendigo lurking just outside, its eyes glowing with hunger. The next morning, I decided to investigate the source of the scream. I packed a small bag with some provisions and set out into the forest. The snow was deep, and each step was an effort, but I pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity. I followed the tracks left by animals and the faint signs of human presence, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. After several hours, I came across a small, abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, and there were signs of a struggle. Blood stained the snow, and I found a torn piece of clothing snagged on a nearby branch. My heart raced as I realized that whatever had happened here was no accident. I scanned the area, looking for more clues, and that was when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half buried in the snow, was a body. I approached cautiously, my breath visible in the frigid air. The sight that greeted me was worse than anything I could have imagined. The corpse was mutilated, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and its face frozen in a mask of horror. But what struck me most was the look of starvation. The body was emaciated, as if it had been consumed from the inside out. I knew then that the trapper's stories were true. The Wendigo was real, and it was here, in these woods. Panic set in, and I fled back to my cabin, stumbling through the snow like a madman. The journey seemed to take forever, and by the time I reached my door, I was half frozen and delirious with fear. I barricaded myself inside, determined to wait out the winter and avoid whatever fate had befallen the poor soul in the clearing. But the Wendigo was not so easily evaded. Over the next few days, I began to hear strange noises outside my cabin. At first, it was just the sound of something moving through the snow, but soon it escalated to scratching at the walls and low, guttural growls. I tried to keep myself occupied, chopping wood and repairing my gear, but the fear was always there, a constant presence that gnawed at my sanity. I started to have vivid nightmares, dreams in which I was being hunted by the Wendigo, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of its growls still echoing in my ears. One night, as I sat by the fire, trying to stay warm, I heard a voice. It was a soft, almost hypnotic whisper, calling my name. Elijah. Elijah, I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked around the cabin, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from outside, beckoning me into the night. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my rifle and opened the door. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath my boots. The voice continued to call me, leading me deeper into the woods. I followed it, unable to resist, as if I was in a trance. After what felt like hours, I found myself at the edge of a frozen lake. The moonlight reflected off the ice, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. And there, standing in the center of the lake, was the Wendigo. It was a towering figure, gaunt and skeletal, with glowing eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. Its presence radiated a cold, malevolent energy that made my blood run cold. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking, but the Wendigo simply stared at me, its eyes boring into my soul. Elijah, it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. Join me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming hunger, a craving that I couldn't control. It was as if the Wendigo's presence was consuming me from the inside out. I dropped my rifle and fell to my knees, clutching my head as the hunger grew stronger. I could feel myself changing, my body transforming into something monstrous. No, I screamed, fighting against the darkness that threatened to overwhelm me. I won't become like you. With a final surge of strength, I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled back toward the cabin. The Wendigo's voice echoed in my mind, growing fainter as I put more distance between us. You cannot escape me, Elijah. You will become one of us. I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. The hunger was still there, a gnawing pain that threatened to consume me, but I knew I had to fight it. I couldn't let the Wendigo win. The rest of the winter passed in a blur of fear and hunger. I rationed my food carefully, trying to stave off the transformation for as long as possible. But as the days grew longer and the snow began to melt, I felt the Wendigo's presence fading. It was as if the creature's power was tied to the harshness of the winter, and with the arrival of spring, it was losing its hold on me. When the last of the snow finally melted, I left my cabin and made my way to the nearest village. I was a shadow of my former self, gaunt and haunted by the memories of that terrible winter. But I had survived, and I vowed to warn others of the danger that lurked in the woods. Even now, years later, I can still feel the Wendigo's hunger, a lingering presence that I must constantly fight against. The legend is real, and the creature is out there, waiting for the next harsh winter to awaken its malevolent spirit. And I know that if I ever let my guard down, the Wendigo will return, and I will become one of its ravenous monsters. My name is Sofia Martinez, and I grew up in a small village in Mexico, where the legend of La Llorona was as real to us as the mountains that surrounded our homes. The adults used her tale to keep us children in line, warning us to stay away from the river after dark. They said she was a vengeful spirit, cursed to wander the earth, weeping for the children she had drowned in a fit of rage. I never believed the stories, thinking them nothing more than old wives' tales. But that changed one fateful night when I was 16. It was late October, and the village was preparing for Dia de los Muertos. The air was filled with the scent of marigolds and the sound of laughter as families decorated altars to honor their deceased loved ones. I was helping my abuela with our altar when my best friend, Isabella, came rushing in, breathless and excited. "Sofia, come with me." "I found something amazing by the river," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I hesitated. "Isabella, you know we're not supposed to go near the river at night. What if La Llorona is there?" She rolled her eyes. "Don't be silly, Sofia. Those are just stories to scare little kids. Besides, we're not kids anymore." Her words struck a chord with me. I didn't want to be seen as a scared child, so I reluctantly agreed. We snuck out of my house and made our way to the riverbank, the moon casting an eerie glow on the water. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. Isabella led me to a small clearing where the moonlight illuminated something half buried in the mud. It was a small, ornate box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. We both knelt down, curiosity getting the better of us. "Let's open it," Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper. I felt a pang of fear but nodded. Together we pried the box open, revealing a beautiful necklace inside. It was delicate, with a silver chain and a pendant shaped like a teardrop, glistening in the moonlight. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers made contact, a chill ran through me, and a mournful wail echoed through the night. We both froze, our eyes wide with terror. The wail grew louder, closer, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Isabella, we need to go," now I said, my voice trembling. But before we could move, she appeared. La Llorona. She emerged from the shadows, her long, white dress flowing around her as if she were part of the river itself. Her face was hidden behind a veil, but I could see the glistening of tears beneath it. "Miss Hijos." "Donde están Miss Hijos?" she cried, her voice filled with an agony that pierced my soul. I grabbed Isabella's hand, and we ran, stumbling through the underbrush in our desperation to escape. But La Llorona's cries followed us, growing louder and more frantic. I risked a glance back and saw her floating towards us, her arms outstretched. We finally reached the village, breathless and terrified. We burst into my house, slamming the door behind us. My abuela looked up from the altar, her eyes widening in shock. "What happened?" she demanded. "Llorona," I panted. "She's real. We saw her by the river." My abuela's face grew pale, and she hurried to lock the doors and windows, muttering prayers under her breath. "You must never go near the river again, Sophia. La Llorona's curse is real, and she will not rest until she finds her children." That night I barely slept, the sound of La Llorona's wails echoing in my mind. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. I would catch glimpses of her reflection in mirrors, hear her sobbing in the dead of night, and feel a cold presence watching me. I knew I had to do something to break the curse, but I didn't know where to start. Desperate for answers, I went to see the village elder, Don Manuel. He was a wise man, well-versed in the old legends and traditions. I told him everything, from finding the box to seeing La Llorona. Don Manuel listened carefully, then nodded. "The necklace you found is tied to La Llorona's spirit. It is likely something she cherished in life, and now it binds her to this world. You must return it to the river and perform a cleansing ritual to release her spirit." I felt a flicker of hope. What do I need to do? He gave me a list of items: marigolds, sage, and a white candle. He instructed me to go to the river at midnight, place the necklace in the water, and perform the ritual to cleanse the spirit. That night, I gathered the items and made my way back to the river, my heart pounding with fear. Isabella insisted on coming with me, despite my protests. "We're in this together," she said firmly. As the clock struck midnight, we stood at the riverbank, the moon casting an eerie glow on the water. I placed the necklace in the river and lit the candle, its flickering flame casting shadows on our faces. We arranged the marigolds in a circle and burned the sage, its fragrant smoke rising into the night. I began to recite the words Don Manuel had taught me, my voice trembling. "Espíritu atormentado, te ofrezco esta luz y estas flores. Deja este mundo y encuentra paz. Libera tu alma del tormento y descansa en paz." As I spoke, the water around the necklace began to shimmer, and the air grew colder. La Llorona's wails filled the night, growing louder and more desperate. I continued the ritual, tears streaming down my face as I pleaded with her to find peace. Suddenly, a gust of wind extinguished the candle, and La Llorona appeared before us, her face twisted in sorrow and rage. "Miss Hijos? Donde están Miss Hijos?" she cried, her voice echoing through the trees. I felt a surge of determination. "Your children are gone, La Llorona. You must let go and find peace." She wailed, her cries piercing the night, but slowly, the necklace began to sink into the river, disappearing into the depths. La Llorona's form shimmered and began to fade, her wails growing softer until they were nothing more than a whisper. The air grew still and I knew the ritual had worked. La Llorona was gone, her spirit finally at rest. Isabella and I stood in silence, the weight of what we had experienced settling over us. We returned to the village, and I told Don Manuel what had happened. He nodded, a look of relief on his face. "You have done well, Sophia. La Llorona's curse has been lifted, and her spirit is at peace." Life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I realized that the legends of our ancestors held truths that we couldn't always understand. La Llorona was a reminder of the pain and suffering that can linger long after death, but also of the power of forgiveness and redemption. I never went near the river at night again, and I made sure to pass on the story of La Llorona to the younger generations, not as a tale of fear, but as a lesson in compassion and the importance of letting go. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear the faint sound of weeping in the wind, and I say a silent prayer for La Llorona, hoping that she has finally found the peace she so desperately sought. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.